Hello, everyone. I want to now continue my lecture on creativity, flow, and transcendent experience. Uh, and we're kind of looking at the psychology of Sufism. I would be the first to admit that the Sufis themselves would insist on their endeavors in this regard being an experience of reality and might not necessarily agree and subjecting their experiences to this kind of analysis. But nevertheless, I think there is an intersection here, and that what psychologists have found about these peak experiencers or transcendent experiences perhaps can shed some light on the Sufi path. So we have already discussed in this class the ideas of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian psychologist, who found, beginning in the 1960s through experimentation, that people sometimes got into a state of mind that he called flow, where they're doing something that they're really good at, but which they've trained to be good at. Wasn't something that came naturally. And while they're in that state, time seems to disappear, or sometimes it goes really slow or really fast. And there's a calmness, a certain state of mind that comes from this activity. And I think, at the very least, part of what's going on in some of these Sufi rituals is an achievement of flow. I think that's what some of the poetry is talking about. Csikszentmihalyi says that this endeavor that produces this state should have clear goals, and it should be the kind of thing where, if you take a wrong turn, you immediately know it, that you're getting feedback. So he talks about, like, if you're piloting a ship and you need to adjust the sails. The task should be difficult enough to be a challenge, but of course should be accessible to one's skills. You can't spend time worrying about having not done it perfectly or any kind of failure. And then he says, when you get into this flow, your self-consciousness disappears. So you stop being distracted, and you have a sense of timelessness, or sometimes distorted time. This is a very pleasurable experience. People go back for more of it. It's calming, and it's not pursued typically for the result so much as for the process. So I've found this clip from a nice video, a documentary on the Mevlevi Sufis in Turkey that I think exemplifies some of these principles, and I want to share it here.
But in some ways, the whirling sema speaks for itself. For even a casual observer, it is clearly sublime. For the Mevlevi, it is one part of their culture and religion which they feel a little safer discussing.
Dünya ile o anda hiçbir ilişkisi yoktur. Dünyaya ait semazın hiçbir şey sema ederken düşünemez. Düşündüğü zaman başı girer, yere yıkılır. Semazın o anda aşktadır. Aşktadır, kendinden geçmiştir. Everything is rolling
from a centrum. For example, protons and neutrons, it's whirling from atom. Stars is whirling around a sun, and these suns are whirling from another galaxy. This is the time that I can feel I am a part of this all whirling on the universe, and I whirl around of my heart. We are make a voyager to ourselves.
We love the world, it's worship for us, it is a peaceful time for us, so it's a beautiful time. We think the gods, and we are repeating the God's name inside, Allah, and we think the beauty.
It is a staggering physical feat to whirl like this for an hour or more. For the Medlevi, it is a unique spiritual feat as well. They aspire to enter an ecstatic state where they can communicate with God. This direct communication poses the biggest threat to Islamic orthodoxy, as well as other unique concepts, such as Hassan Dedi's belief in immortality for Semizans who give everything for God, and reincarnation for those who don't.
Bunlar anlıyor musun? Tekrar bu aleme, devrana insan olarak gelirler. Kendilerini tamamlamaları için. Maria okulda kalmış bu sene tekrar devam etmeye.
Well, I should underline that last bit about reincarnation is an idiosyncratic belief. Most Sufis don't believe in reincarnation. Most Muslims don't. There are lots of sects in the Muslim world, however, that have their own distinctive beliefs about these things. It's not part of the Mevlevi tradition or the Rumi tradition, this belief that this gentleman expressed in reincarnation. The important thing is that you saw a little bit about how they feel about their Sufi dance, and it sounds very much, in my view, like flow. These experiences are also present in the literature that we've been reading. So Attar, in his biography of Bayezid Bistami, says that once he attained independence of all creatures, so he's not attached to anybody, he's not dependent on anybody, then God illumined him with his light. And Bistami gazed on the divine with the eye of certainty. This is a state of detachment that, of course, is difficult to achieve, and most people don't achieve it. In fact, there's a contradiction in the biography that Bistami was very attracted to, very attached to his mother, and also knew that the Quran commands respect for and support of one's parents. So he is said to have gone to her and pleaded with her to give him his freedom from her own volition, to allow him to pursue this independent path without attachment to her, and that she did so. So Bistami at this point gazes within himself. Initially, he's repulsed. He sees only foulness, human carnal desires, and so forth. But then ultimately discovered, Attar says, the good inside himself. And that good, however, is not from himself, but it's the light of God shining within him. And he says, whatever the eye of my physical body perceived, it perceived through him. So he addresses God. He says, Lord God, what is this? And God says, all that I am and none other than I. So this is an immersion in the divine and an escape from the limitations of the self. And at this point, the Attar says, Bayezid came to desire only reality. My attributes, he says, were annihilated in his attributes. So a human being, might be cranky. God is merciful and bestows his good pleasure on his creatures. So the human defects have to be replaced, Attar is saying, by emulation of these divine virtues. And he says, no trace of me was visible. In my intoxication, he says, I flung myself into every valley. This is probably a reference to those stations or way stations on the spiritual path. And the poetry, uses hyperbole to express the vastness of the spiritual achievement here. He says, in my intoxication, I flew in the expanse of his unity, of God's unity, for 30,000 years. So there's a doctrine among the Sufis that even the most realized Sufi master is much lesser than the prophets. And so in this section of the biography, Attar says that Bistami reached the sole of the foot of the Prophet Muhammad, but he couldn't rise higher than that. That he beheld 100,000 seas of fire, 1,000 veils of light. He became bewildered with awe, confusion. Nothing remained of him. And God says, be delivered from your yourness. So again, it's a very different tradition, and there's no exact parallel, but there's something of the Buddhist idea of no self in this Sufi description of the highest stages of realization, in which one puts away one's own personality and idiosyncratic attributes in favor of the unity of God. Another story I've had you read in this connection is that of Rumi, and he tells this tale, fable of a competition between the Chinese and the Greeks. So there's a king, and he has both Greeks and Chinese at his court. Maybe they're long-distance merchants originally, but they get into an argument with one another, and the king suggests that they settle it with a debate. These stories about sort of ethnic competition are still a genre in the modern Middle East. And when I was living there, I was in Beirut. They told me a story that, there was a band of traveling Turks and Arabs together. And one evening they were sitting around the campfire and they got into an argument about whether Turks or Arabs are superior. So the Arabs would say, well, we invented algebra, and the Turks would say, well, we conquered Constantinople, and they would argue back and forth in these ways. And finally, the Arabs are said to have played the trump card. They said, oh yeah, well, the Prophet Muhammad was an Arab, so they thought that would settle the matter. But the Turks, not to be outdone, came back. They said, oh yeah, God is a Turk. And these stories of ethnic competition nowadays take on a kind of nationalistic aura, but they're there in the medieval period in Rumi as well. So the king says, settle it with a debate. And the Chinese then put forward their debating points, but the Greeks, in Rumi's telling, stayed silent. The debate went nowhere, so then everybody left. So then the Chinese said, well, we could settle this in a different way. Let's both create a work of art, and the king can decide who produced the superior art. So the king gave them a huge hall, and he put a curtain down the middle of it, so each of them had their own workspace. And then he gave them colors, a whole palette. And so he supplied them with 100 different colors, and the Greeks came and delighted and took various colors and started work. The Greeks didn't take any colors. They just went to their side of the hall. They said, the colors are not part of our work. So the Greeks went to their side of the hall beyond the curtain and started polishing the wall. One can imagine, a marble wall, something that's pretty shiny. And the Chinese on their side of the curtain created a magnificent mural, and murals are a big part of Chinese art. And then when they finally completed it, held a big celebration. They were beating drums and singing and dancing. And they were sure that they had demonstrated the superiority of Chinese culture. The Greeks then pulled the curtain dividing the rooms, and since they had polished their wall to be a mirror, the Chinese mural was reflected on the Greek side and took on special characteristics because of being a reflection. So it danced and changed in the light. It was more dynamic than the Chinese mural. So Rumi comes back and explains that the Greeks symbolized the Sufi way. And again, we saw with the story of Bayezid Bistami that Attar tells that effacing individual defects, sins, flaws, in favor of the purity of the divine is important to this process. So by giving up base desires, giving up anger, the Sufi polishes the soul. And Rumi says it's that process of giving up these base desires and these unworthy emotions like anger, that the Sufis learned to make poems, that it's the source of their creativity. I think a very different theory of creativity than would be common in our culture today, where individualism is celebrated and sort of being the ultimate you is the way to be creative. Rumi's telling, it's by putting aside key aspects of your own propensities that creativity then can well up. And Rumi says, are you jealous of the ocean's generosity? The ocean bestows water and fish and salt and so many good things on human beings. And he says that the Sufis should be the same way. Why would you refuse to give this joy to anyone? Why would you refuse to share with people this technique for developing creativity and for developing one's gifts? So at this point, I'd like to share with you another clip. This is a performance of Rumi with Iranian music and singing to give you a sense of how he's cultivated in his own culture today.
بیا که از عشق تو دیوانه گشتم وگر شهری بودم ویرانه گشتم ز عشق تو ز خان و مان بریدم به درد عشق تو هم خانه گشتم چنان کائل بودم کان را چو دیدم روی تو مردان گشتم
Then one last story for today. Rumi tells the story of Father Reason. He says that the universe is ruled by reason. So again, this is a Neoplatonic conception. And Rumi refers to reason as a father. So he knows that children often rebel against the authority of the father, and he says that doing so in this case, rebelling against the rule of Father Reason, makes the world seem abject and ugly. Making peace with the Father of Reason, with Father Reason, allows beauty then to well up. So he says when a person makes up a story for his or her child, that parent becomes a father, we would say a father or a mother, and a child together, listening. So again, by taking on these abstract attributes like reason, the individual shares and grows and becomes more expansive rather than being diminished. Giving up in Sufism is a form of fulfillment rather than diminishment. So we'll leave it there for today. Just to say that we've talked about the psychology of Sufism and elements of feelings of transcendent unity with the ultimate in the Sufi tradition, and we've talked a little bit about what the basis might be for understanding some of those feelings, some of those experiences in psychology. We've also discussed the connection between, and a connection that is mentioned by authors like Rumi, between that experience, which we might now call flow, and creativity. And so, although the Sufi tradition has an ascetic and self-denying, renunciatory aspect to it, not all Sufis were ascetics. There were lots that lived normal lives, were tradesmen or lived in society, had families, and many were creative individuals. Even a smith, produces a masterwork, and they saw their Sufi activities often as contributing to this creativity. So we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.